Well, good morning and welcome to our live video. My name is Peter Frank. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology here at Concordia Technology Solutions, and we've been having these weekly live videos all year. It's been a great opportunity to talk with guests about how they are utilizing the best practices in technology in their congregations or in their ministry. And today we have our frequent blogger, Reverend Bill Johnson. He is the Director of Educational Technology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he always has such fascinating topics for us. Today we're going to get very much into his realm when it comes into learning. And so, Bill, I'm excited to have you join us and talk about how to implement a software solution in a church. And really we're going to talk about what happens when you've tried to implement it and it hasn't started. So before we get too far, can you tell us a little bit about your role there at the seminary and just how you kind of take some of these practices, best practices in your job?
Sure. Well, one of the hats I wear here is as coordinator of educational technology, combination of the technology that we're using to train our students. So not only our distance students who are learning online completely at a distance, facilitated by digital technology, but also our students in the classroom. What are we using there? And that's everything from, the whiteboards, that kind of thing that we use. I mean, obviously those are technology in the strictest sense. There's not a real big training curve there. We kind of got that down. But then looking at projectors, looking at smart classrooms, looking at what are the tools we use on the technology side to help make the teaching more effective, as well as then what are the techniques just pedagogically we can use to make sure that we're having the maximum impact for our students, making them into the very best pastors and deaconesses they can be in the long term.
That's fantastic. I think it's wonderful how technology has influenced education, especially as we talk about preparing church workers to go out into the field. And you just think about the difference between now and even 20 years ago, certainly more than that, and what technology has done to increase those educational opportunities. So that's fantastic. And as always, I thank you for joining us today. Let's dig into this topic.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. Let's dig into this topic today that you wrote a blog post on, and it is this idea of software training for successful change in a congregational setting. So you start off the blog post by telling us an all too common story about software gathering dust. And I like that phrase. There's a little bit more to it than just the whole gathering dust, but can you briefly retell this story to our audience and explain how a software could possibly gather dust?
Well, I think anybody who's worked in technology for any length of time has seen some version of this, where you get a new tool or perhaps even just a new version of an older tool that everybody's used to. And you go to all the trouble to research it, purchase it, roll it out, get the server set up, all the different things on the tech side that we know goes into configuring these things. And you send it out to your end users and you hold the initial trainings, that kind of thing. You get everybody where you think you're poised for success, and you go off to work on 6 other things because that's the nature of tech work. We were just talking about how today's been running away from us before we went on the air. And you come back 6 weeks later, and you discover that the church secretary is no longer using the brilliant, church database software you put together. She's just exporting it to an Excel file and doing it exactly the way she used to do it. Or, you find that the paper records, the typewriters and the carbon paper haven't really gone away like they were supposed to. And so you've made this massive investment of time and energy, certainly, and sometimes even a massive investment of money, depending on the product. And you're in this place now where everything is exactly like it was before, and all of that energy and effort seems like it was wasted.
Do you think that this is a problem that is more common in churches than in other organizations, or maybe less common? If so, why or why not?
Well, I think it is potentially more common in churches. Let me put it that way. It's common anywhere where you have too much work to do and too few people to do the work. And, our Lord said the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few, and he didn't actually mean technology work. We'll own that. But at the same time, there's truth there. There's always more to do when you're in church work. There's always that next thing you could be doing. And so it is so often easy to get overloaded, to realize that the newsletter's got to be out next week and you don't know who you're mailing it to. And so I'll just export the Excel sheet. I know there's a better way. I know there's a faster way to do it. But right now, I don't have the time it would take to get up to speed on that and get comfortable with it. So I'm just going to go with what I know and get it done. And so often, like I said, that's not a unique problem to churches,
Right.
but it is a problem a lot of churches suffer from.
Absolutely, and I know that, as we work with churches, it's hard to remember that sometimes because we hear about what they're doing and how there's a much better way of doing it, but there's always that learning curve. There's always that time, and so you have to invest more time before you can start saving time, and that's a tough trade-off. And I think the end users, the people who are in the church office on the computers, are the ones who know that more than anybody else. And not only are they having to learn it, they're going to have to teach the volunteers and others to use it. So, yeah, it's a common challenge, and I'm sure if we could see our audience, they're kind of nodding their heads right now because, yeah, that happens so often.
Well, we've all lived it,
Absolutely. Let's talk about how to go about kind of fixing this. And the first thing that you suggest in your blog post is this idea of a church technologist. Can you explain, first off, what a church technologist is? That's not a phrase that I think is commonly used, but I think as you describe it, people understand exactly what you mean.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I don't know that it's an official title any more than if you jump back 20 or 30 years, parish nurse was super common. But it's definitely becoming more of a thing as we realize that the church has got to be plugged into technology. Like any other business, and the church is more than a business. I don't want to get too far over in that side of things, but there's definitely a piece of what the church does that runs very much like the business. And so we're dealing with computers, we're dealing with secretaries and networks and all of these different pieces and software packages and the Wi-Fi throughout the building, all of those kinds of things, as well as, as we've talked about in the past, the security of that data, a lot of which is very personal and very private, and you want to go to great pains to keep that safe. And so every church generally has somebody doing this. Sometimes they're doing it badly. Sometimes they don't actually know, what's happening, or they don't necessarily recognize a lot of the threats that are out there. But a lot of times you've got somebody who's a professional in IT and who is volunteering their time and they're taking care of these things and doing it well. But very, very rarely are they a full-time paid staff member or anything like that. This is a volunteer basis thing, and whether it's your webmaster or just the guy who knows how to set up the Wi-Fi, chances are you've got a technologist or two that you're working with, and you want to make sure that they've got the tools they need to succeed as well.
Good. So you've got this church technologist who's most likely a volunteer working with the paid or part-time staff and other volunteers. And you say that this person can kind of take two different roles. And I know you mentioned that it was Jason Iowan, your CIO at the seminary, who kind of explained this to you or kind of started this idea. So we want to give him full credit. But the two different paths or roles that this church technologist can play are a describer or a prescriber. I'll say that again, a describer or prescriber. And I think we might have lost Bill on the video here. We'll get him back in just a second. So when he jumps back in, I'll have him answer this. As we talk about technology, we've been having issues with this live stream. So Bill, all right, you're back. So if you can
cool.
kind of explain the difference between a describer or a prescriber as a church technologist.
Sure. So, the thing is, as technology people, there's this real temptation because we know our tech. At the very least, we believe we know our tech. Whether we really do or not, okay, fine. But we believe we do, and so there's this real temptation to come into the situation and say, okay, you're doing X, so obviously the right tool for you is Y, and to go ahead and pick that up and run with it and enforce your decision on what they're doing. And there's some good reasons to do that, and we'll kind of unpack those in a little bit, but in general, you want to strike a little bit more of a balance. On the other side of it, you don't want the end users just willy-nilly running and grabbing software packages, and then you're suddenly left with a pile of independent things that you've got to try to make talk to each other. And anybody who's ever tried to take 3 or 4 systems and make them all work together knows that that can just be a nightmare. And inevitably at that point you run into the third party problem where package X doesn't work with package Y, and X says it's Y's fault, Y says it's X's fault, and you're stuck in the middle with something that doesn't work. And so that balance between the user really getting to describe, getting to talk about what it is they need, while at the same time being able to connect it to the larger technological framework of the entire organization, and being able to make sure that this is going to live well in the ecosystem of other stuff we have.
And you've mentioned some scenarios already. What would be kind of the more common one, or the one you'd recommend, or which situation would you recommend a describer over a prescriber, or vice versa?
A good balance between them. Good Lutheran answer, I know.
Yep.
Both ends, never either or. But no, the reality is that you want to be engaged and listen and find out what they're really trying to accomplish, and balance that over against the needs of the entire organization. So for example, in the seminary context, we may very often have a mission that needs a very specific set of functions, but that data then needs to talk to the student services side once students are admitted. And so it's all well and good to listen to admission. We absolutely do and need to. That's great partnership there. But we've got to make sure that whatever software we're looking at to work with them is also then going to feed over and give the data to student services when they need it, without a lot of hand-holding from the IT staff, because we don't have unlimited hours either.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think in the church setting, communication is a key part of that, because you can't assume anything, and so having those conversations with your your paid staff, your full-time people, and your volunteers, I think that kind of helps get down that path of what is it that we truly need, without making any assumptions. That's always a bad approach to take, especially for people who are volunteers and are not sitting in the office. And I know I've made that mistake myself in interacting with different churches, is just assuming to know what they need. But still, there's knowledge that needs to be brought forward. So as we talk about this problem, oftentimes it seems like this idea of training is the root cause of why people are not using the software that the church has purchased for them. Why might that not always be the case? What could be some of the other problems before we get too deep into training? Uh-oh. I think we just lost Bill again. I apologize to our audience. We'll get him back in just a second. Like I explained before, we've had a lot of different issues with our live stream. It generally is our guest connection, and it's every single guest lately. So it has nothing to do with just Bill. So we're exploring different options. We haven't got all of our tech set up yet to move on to the new solution. So bear with us. All right, Bill, you're back. Sorry about that.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so on this idea of training, so often, and this is perhaps a
Uh-oh, we lost him again. This is, sorry, Bill. I think we've got Bill on the phone just because we've been having these issues, but of course that's not going across into our live stream. So we'll give him another second. We'll see if this continues. We may have to defer to the blog post. All right, Bill, I think you're back again. Hopefully we'll keep you longer than a few seconds this time.
All right, here's hoping. Gotta love technology. So often we default to the idea that if somebody's not doing something, then what we've got is a training problem. They don't know how. And so we schedule a bunch of training classes, and people spend lots of valuable time to attend. And at the end of it, we find they're still exporting the same Excel spreadsheet. And so before we pursue training as a solution, it really behooves us to take a step back from that and to look at the situation and say, okay, is training really the issue here? Is it the kind of thing where if they absolutely had to, they could do it? And a great diagnostic question on this one is actually from Dr. Mager's book. I cited in the blog post. And he asked if their life depended on it. So invent whatever sort of evil genius scenario you want to work with here. But if their life depended on it, could they print the newsletter labels the new way? Because if they could, even if they have to fumble through it and think about it for a minute, then chances are it's not a training problem. They know how to do it. The question is then, what else is getting in the way? Do they have a time constraint that's forcing them back to the old way? Is there something defective about the way the new way works? The labels don't look as good, or they're not post office acceptable, or whatever? Is there a supervisor who is just not adequately rewarding the time it takes to invest and to learn new skills? And, that's resulting in a lack of motivation. There's lots of different possibilities here. And of course, we have to also own the reality it may just be the employee doesn't want to do it. And that can also be an issue, and that's a separate conversation for another day, I suppose. But looking at all of these different facets of it to decide, okay, is this really a knowledge or skill gap that we can solve with training? Or are there other tools, other ways we can work with the user to get them what they need so that they can be effective and use the new software effectively?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's easy to just throw more time and energy and money at training. But if that's not the root cause, then it's just wasting all of those resources. And so you kind of have to do the detective work of figuring out what is really going on. But let's assume that in a church setting that training is the issue. You've got some recommendations about how to go about training your church staff. And you also mentioned the ARCS model in the post. Can you kind of describe that and how that fits into training church staff?
Sure, absolutely. The couple different pieces there. One is if you're going to train, then train hands-on. Let people get in and really work with the software. Sitting just watching somebody else work with the software is almost never effective. Simply because there's an aspect of technology training that is about muscle memory. It's about physically doing the things as well as knowing what to do. So if you're able, you've got the freedom within your church or school to be able to set up in a lab and really do the training that way. That's the ideal circumstance. The other piece that goes along with that then is work to the greatest degree possible with real world data. Test data is all fine and wonderful, but if you can even just import a shadow copy or work with a real world scenario, then it'll be all that much more familiar, and you'll be able to actually just neurologically connect with more familiar things that are already learned, already stored in memory, and be able to create more connections to the new knowledge, which is going to help it stick longer. Finally, the other thing in terms of training, and we'll talk a little bit about ARCs and motivation, is if you can do it, if you've got the time, and this is a challenge, then doing the training in bite-sized doses just in time when the user is in the middle of doing it and has a need for it for their immediate job function is great. The closer the training is to the use, the better off you are. If you can do it in the moment when they need it, that's ideal. Chances are you're going to have to at least back up a little bit from that and do a day-long training session or similar. You're not going to be able to be there and be on hand just when they need it. So the closer you can get between training and actual use and practice, the better off you are for long-term retention. As we turn to motivation then, that's where Keller's ARCS model really starts to be pretty valuable, where basically what he theorizes is in order to see students be motivated to succeed and motivated to learn, you have 4 factors that you need to consider. First of all, you need to have their attention. That's the A in the model. It runs down the list. And that's not super hard by and large, especially if you're dealing with adult learners. They know this training is important or they wouldn't be spending the time on it. However, at the same time, being funny, having some humor worked in, having some engaging stories, that kind of thing, basically don't make it boring. If they don't hear what you're saying, then they're not going to learn anything. So having that ability to really train and to have your learners hear you is a huge, huge first step. Having their attention, giving them specific examples, real world models they can work with. From there, they've got to see the relevance. And I know I'm guilty of this. I've sat through trainings and I'm paying attention, I'm hearing what's said. I just know I'm never going to use this stuff.
Yeah.
And so I sit through it, I listen to it, but I'm not learning it, I'm not retaining it, I'm not storing it for long term. If you ask me in the hour or two after it, then maybe I can tell you about it, but a week later it's gone. And so helping them see the relevance, where is this new software, new skill that they're learning going to be immediately applicable to making what they do more effective or more useful to the church and to the kingdom of God. From there, we've done AR, we get to see, we're talking about confidence. They've got to have the feeling or the capacity, sometimes the model gets changed to, that they can do this. If you go into your average church secretary, and I've met a few very above average ones that, would react differently, but if you go into your average one and you ask them, hey, can you help me out with some assembly programming? Chances are their eyes are going to glaze over and you're just not going to be able to, no matter how much you train, they're not going to engage because they don't have a lot of the foundational knowledge to dig into that. So it has to be a skill set that's reasonably obtainable, that they feel like they can do. So providing prerequisites ahead of time, letting them know, hey, before you come in here, these are what you need to know. Being able to be very honest with them and say, okay, before we do this, can we sit down for an hour or two and let me show you just some of the foundational stuff that's going to help you learn this more effectively, that kind of thing. Having a really good, what we would call learner analysis is going to help you give them the confidence to succeed, help them be able to see that this is something that isn't out of reach for them. So, and then finally, satisfaction. They've got to be able to try it, do it, and realize that it worked, and have that cool moment where you look at that, whatever it was you did, and realize, hey, that worked. That did what it was supposed to do. I did everything right, and it's fun. Being successful, learning a new skill, and successfully using it in the real world is a lot of fun. And so giving them that satisfaction, closing the loop, and letting that then feed into future learning as well is another huge piece of that motivational model.
Thank you very much for explaining that. And that last point, that satisfaction, really hits home with me with when me and some of our team were going out doing some field testing on our new offering entry approach in Church 360 members. This was several years ago. And we were working with Rosalie, who's a retired volunteer at church. She's, I think, well into her 70s and will be the first to tell you that she's not a computer expert. And we were watching her, how she was entering in the offerings, and then our lead programmer said, well, what if you move the offering envelopes over to this side, and then you can do this with your left hand and this with your right hand. And she tried it, and she entered a few offerings, and she got so excited, like she jumped up and gave him a high five and was like, I got it, this is great. And that goes back to that satisfaction thing. And I always point back to that story because, yeah, that's the goal. You want people to be so satisfied with it that kind of locks that knowledge in. I think that's a great model. I appreciate you being willing to share that with us. Any final thoughts before we end for today for our audience on what they should be thinking about as you go about training a staff or getting ready to really adopt a new software? Any final thoughts?
I think the biggest challenge for me is honestly just taking that step back and realizing that not everybody has the same aptitudes. And I run into it here where we have professors who have forgotten more of the Greek language than I have ever learned. And I can get through it and put a good sermon together, I like to think, but they can open up the Greek New Testament and just read it and live and breathe in that world. And I'm very much the same way with technology. I get a new device and the instruction manual goes in the back seat while I'm unwrapping it and figuring out how this thing works without bothering to read anything. It's just, I live and breathe in that world. And most of us who are in technology do. We have that affinity for it and we enjoy it. But a lot of people don't. And so stepping out of that mindset to say, okay, if I weren't comfortable with this, what are the things I'm going to need to know? What are the things I'm going to need to learn in order to feel comfortable operating and working within this system? And to have the patience to take the baby steps sometimes with them to really get them up to speed and get them comfortable in the system, comfortable knowing they're not going to break anything. They're not going to, blow up the database. The server's not going to melt down and fire and blood everywhere or anything like that. And knowing that they too have the skill set, just not the confidence to be able to do this. And so that level of support and patience is huge when we're talking about training, particularly with a audience that's not always technically adept.
Well, thank you again, Bill. I appreciate you going into that. And that final point is something that I think we all need to remember, especially those of us who train on technology, is that we just all think and learn differently. And for people like you and I, we grew up with technology, but many people didn't. So that is a very good point. Well, Bill, thanks again for joining us, and thank you to our audience for watching. Again, I apologize for our technical difficulties, but we are working on that, and we'll get that figured out soon. I invite you to join us next week as we talk with Laura Horn about how to use Evernote within the church. She's got some great ideas to share. So I hope you join us next Thursday at 11:30 Central Time. We'll see you then. Have a great day.